Today we're going to start talking about basically the rest of Django. So we've, the last couple of days, been focusing on the models, right? So all of the ORM and the backend stuff that Django does. The creating tables, making requests, modifying, all that stuff, right? So that's here, that's this bottom left corner. So if you look at the basic structure of how Django works, I'll just review. So we have a client, typically a web browser. It's going to make a request, and that request is going to go to this urls.py. So we've seen it before, and we're going to talk about it. We're going to use it more today. So the initial request is, this is basically like the router. It's going to check the path, so /time or /users or /whatever. And then it's going to parse that out, and then it's going to call the appropriate function basically in views. So there are class-based views and functional views, but for now we're going to use functional views. So let's say you go to /time. That /time is going to get checked and say, oh, well, anytime someone goes to /time, I want to call the I want to call my /time method. So there will be a method defined in views.py for /time. That method will get called, and that method will do whatever it's supposed to do. So that method can grab things from, grab stuff from the database. It can interact with the models. It can take information in that request and then format a request to the database. It can also fetch a template, so it can get HTML, and it can also combine both of these, combine information that it gets from the models with a template, an HTML document, and then that stuff's going to all get packaged together, and it will get sent as a response to the client, which in our case is going to be an HTML document. So that's the basic process for what Django does. So again, we've only been focusing on models. So we're going to look at all of the rest of that stuff, excluding models, and then for the rest of the week, we'll combine everything all together. So what we're going to do is we're going to handle a client request, and we're going to make sure that we appropriately route that request from the urls.py file. And then that request will get routed to the appropriate function in the views file. And then we will call up the appropriate template, format that, package it all together, and then send it as a response to the client. All right. So again, looking at the Django documentation here, we have the three basic layers. We have essentially the views, URLs. You can think of it. I mean, it's hard to know where to put this in that MVC, but the views is kind of the core logic. Models is interacting with the database, and the template is what the client is ultimately going to get. So we have the model layer, the view layer, and the template layer. We're going to focus on the view layer and the template layer. So if we want to start on that, we're going to have to create a Django project. So Anthony, can you tell me how to create a Django project?
All right, first thing, we got to get a virtual environment going. So
okay.
Is it Python bin whatever our name is?
Yep.
-m. Okay.
And then I will activate that.
Source bin, yeah, bin active, yeah.
Okay, so now I've created the virtual environment and it's activated.
Let me look at the first thing we got to do.
Yeah.
Pip and oh wait, we don't have requirements, so we need to go through and install whatever methods or whatever extensions we're going to use.
Okay.
Cool.
So we'll keep it simple, and all we need is Django itself for this.
Is that pip install Django?
Yep. Okay. Install Django. All right, so now I'm in my virtual environment, it's activated, and I have Django. So you can see that I've got Django hanging out there. Okay. So how do I, let's see something else. Jennifer, can you tell me about projects and apps in the Django context?
You have to do a Django admin and then start project, I think, and then the name of the project.
Okay, good. So that's how I do it. Can you just like give us a general overview of what a project is and what an app is in Django?
Oh, okay. So a project is basically the overarching, project. So for an organization, the project might be called whatever the organization is called, and it will encompass all of the different apps that that organization might need to use for that project. So an app is any number of different little pieces of like the project or the website or whatever. So for example, Amazon has a billing app and a shipping app and an app for presenting for searching for products,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah, great. Yes, so that's exactly it. So we'll, if we want to get started by creating a project, I'm just going to give it a generic name. So we're just playing around. Let's see. Jared, how do I actually create a project?
That's the Django-admin start project, and then
Okay.
whatever your name is.
Okay, so I'll just do, we'll just call it my project. All right. So can you tell me anything about what just happened?
I created the skeleton files that you need.
Okay. Can you tell me about any of these files?
I know that we have to add the app to the settings.py.
Okay, so we don't have an app yet, but when we make it, we'll have to add that to the list of installed apps here. Okay, so the settings will contain basically all of the configuration for your project. Includes things like this. A couple of these things we'll talk more about later. Some of them are probably aren't going to need to change at all. So here's the database. What is the default database?
The SQLite.
Yeah. All right. So I have the project. Now I want to create an app. How do I do that?
Django-admin start app, and then.
Okay. So there are a couple different ways we could do this, but I'm going to just cd. We actually don't technically need this outer folder. But anyway, so I'm going to cd into my project. And from here, at the same level as my as my main project, I'm going to create the app. So Django admin start app. I'm just going to call it my app. All right. And so Jess, tell me anything about what just got created when I ran start app.
All right. So the migrations folder is going to eventually have your database migrations. Hold
Okay.
those. It'll have the versions that are going to get migrated up. And I think someone already said you'll have to add my app into the settings of your project to kind of connect the two of them.
Okay. Let's go ahead and do that now. So my project settings. All right.
And
Okay,
you'll
back.
need,
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I thought models went in there, but I guess it goes in the outside.
So actually models is in the app.
It's in the app too. Okay.
Yeah. So models will be per app.
Right.
So-
Okay. That makes more sense. I was like, wait, is it outside? Okay. Yeah. So that's where you will build your models, your classes.
Okay. So that's where the models go. And what is this?
That's going to handle the request from the client.
Mhm.
So depending on what the endpoint of the URL is, Views will direct it, and that'll have a different function for each endpoint and tell it what to do based on the client request.
Okay, good. Exactly. So we'll end up, we haven't written any views yet, but we'll write one today, and then we won't worry about the admin or the apps. But so we have, if we look back at this model here, we have urls.py and then views. And notice we don't have any HTML yet. We don't have anything called templates. So we're gonna have to add that. We do have views and urls.py. So where is urls.py?
It's in the project level, or the project that was created.
Right. So when you initially create this, by default, Django will create this URLs file at the project level. We'll see if you read this, we'll see that you can actually also create a URLs file at the app level. So it will just, any route that's that's at this level, the project level, you can refer it to a given URLs file at the app level, and it can further process that request. But here is the main entry point, the main routing entry point for your project. All right. So we have all of this. We've just done the default stuff. We added our app to the settings. So the next kind of housekeeping thing we should do, strictly speaking, we won't have to for this app, but is there like a next step?
Install the extensions, the Django extensions.
Okay, so we could install Django extensions. So I don't think we'll need to do that necessarily right now. I would do that just to make interacting with the models a little easier, but we actually aren't going to use models. So this is going to be a database-less application. So what I was thinking of in kind of very vague terms was running migrations. So Django make migrations. Whoops, what am I doing? Python manage.py make migrations. Okay, so there's basically, I haven't changed anything, so nothing's going to pick up, but this SQLite database got created. Okay, and if we watch this folder, we will do Python manage.py migrate. Okay, so now we have all we've done is the default Django stuff. So if you look back in our settings file, so the project settings, all of these installed apps, that's where all of this database stuff comes from. So Django has a bunch of installed apps preloaded in your application that handle a lot of basic / more complicated things like authentication that you probably wouldn't want to handle yourself. All right, so once that is taken care of, we can go ahead and start the server. So Django also comes with a development server, which is handy. You can do hot reloading and stuff like that. So in order to run the server, it's Python manage.py run server. So run server. Okay, and it tells me basically if it starts and there's no errors, then you're good. And it's running on port 8000 by default. So I can go ahead and go to local host 8000. And I get this default, your Django is working kind of thing. So this is built in. And what happens if I try to go to / something else? I get an error message, page not found, 404. I get some debugging information. It was a GET request made to whatever / whatever. And then it says, using the URL conf defined in myproject.urls, Django tried these URL patterns in this order. So this admin, where is this coming from? So if we look in myproject.urls, it's saying that basically Django tried to match ASDF to a pattern, but it only had this admin. So that's where this is coming from. Do you think of this basically as like matching a regular expression? So it's going to look, we passed it ASDF. So it's just going to go down and check everything in URL patterns and say, did it match admin? Nope. And then that's all there is in this case. So it throws the error. If we change this, we could do path. We'll do ASDF /. And I'm actually going to do. Okay, so let's first off, let's go to admin to see what that route, admin. So this is a built-in, this is an app, again, this is an app that's built in. So this is the admin panel. In order to use it, we have to create a super user. So we'll worry about that a little bit later, but this is something that exists for you automatically out of the box. All right, so let's go back to ASDF now. And notice that I went to ASDF. And this time, because I defined this route, this is not something you would ever want to do, but I just basically said, if you go to /ASDF, then this built-in admin app should handle that request, right? So that's what happened. And, ASDF, and it that built-in admin function handles that. Now, we don't have real visibility on this, at least unless we look at the source code. But that's the idea, is there's a path that will parse through the URL, get that path, and then refer you to a function, or in this case, another URLs file. Okay, so what we want to do typically is this is like the first stop in the URL parsing. We want to pass things off to our app that are appropriate for our app. So I'm going to say, I'll just do my app. And we're not going to pass it this because that's just stupid. What we actually want to do is refer it to a URLs file in our app. And if we look at our app, we actually don't have a URLs file. So we're going to have to create one. So Django, when you create the app, it will create a lot of stuff by default, but it's not going to create everything that you need necessarily. So here we're going to create a urls.py. It has the same name, but they're in different places, right? This is the app's urls.py. And again, I'm going to breeze by some of this stuff, but we're going to import another function from Django.urls. So let me just take a step back and give you a little caveat and say this is all kind of convoluted, but you're going to go through this process lots of times, so you'll get the hang of it. So the first time it's very confusing. There's a lot happening. So we're going to import path, and then we're also going to import include. And include is basically a helper function that we can use to redirect from the top level URLs to an app's URLs. So we're going to do include, and we're going to pass it my app.urls. Okay, and we're going to rerun the server, and we get an error telling us, but it's a different error than we had at first. So this error is saying it's an improperly configured error, and this is a built-in Django exception. And it's saying the included URL conf, which is this file, urls.py. So this thing that we passed it, my app.urls, which is this file right here that we just created, saying that that file doesn't appear to have any patterns in it, which is true because we just created the file and didn't put anything in it. So now let's fix that error by adding something in urls.py. So we'll import from Django.urls, import path. You can actually, we could actually copy a lot. It's going to look basically the same. So we'll import path. We'll have this URL patterns list, and it's going to contain some path functions. So URL patterns path. Okay, and then path, the first thing that path is going to take is going to be essentially like a regular expression. So if we want to go with the slash, localhost /8000 /my app / whatever. So that could be nothing. So if you just go to my app, it will handle this, and then go here, and then it sees that it's nothing, so it will handle that. You can do that. You could also do, just to make it clear, we'll do /practice. And we'll just something, a reminder for your future self, not including the /. This is one of those little gotchas that you can spend lots of time trying to figure out. So if we go to localhost whatever /my app, my app will go here. And then if we go to /practice after that, this will get called. So from here, we're actually gonna, the second parameter will be a function. So we have to write, we have to pass it a function, which means that we're gonna have to write a function. And we write these functions in the views.py file. So I'm gonna import from .views, import, for now I'll just import okay, and it's telling me, there's kind of a downside to this where you have to kind of get everything connected before you can start doing anything. But that's telling me that I can't import this name practice. So in views, I'm going to do practice, create this function practice, and every view function is going to take a request object as a parameter. So request, and I'm just going to do pass. So finally, we've gotten our server now works. So let's see what happens if we go to this route. So what do we got? My app. So we try to go to my app and it doesn't work. So my app /practice. So we get yet another kind of error here. So this actually worked. And let me, instead of just passing, let me do restart that. So when you save, it does hot reloading. So when you save, it will restart the server. We'll make another request. Still get that error. But we can see that that function actually got called, right? So this function in views.py got called. Now the error, it's a value error, and it's saying that the view my app .views.practice, which is of course my app .views.practice. So this view didn't return an HTTP response object. It returned none instead. So what did this function return?
None.
None. Yeah. So pass will return none. Not having pass, in fact, will also return none. So this function is returning none, and Django is telling us implicitly that view functions have to return HTTP response objects. We don't know what that is, but we can look it up. So Django HTTP response objects. So we can maybe, depending on that happen to be the first result, we could play around with our query. But here's the Django documentation with request and response objects. So here's something about an HTTP request, and let's see, the error says we need an HTTP response object. So we could look at the response object. Okay, so HTTP response objects. So in contrast to HTTP request objects, which are created automatically by Django. So we'll look at request objects in a second. HTTP response objects are your responsibility. Each view you write is responsible for instantiating, populating, and returning an HTTP response. So any view that we write is going to have to return an HTTP response. And it tells us that it lives in Django.http. So let's try importing it, Django.http. So from Django.http, import HTTP response. And let's just see if this works. HTTP. So now I'm going to refresh this. And I didn't get any errors. You can see it's nothing, but it's nothing in a, I guess, in a good way, like Seinfeld or something. So we have this. We fulfilled the basic requirements of Django at this point. So we have a way to handle incoming requests. We route it through URLs.py files. Ultimately, it gets routed to the specific view function that we want to call. We call the function, and that function has to return an HTTP response object, which is exactly what we did. So we can look through some more of this documentation. So it looks like typical usage is to pass the contents of the page as a string by string or memory view to the HTTP response. So it looks like basically HTTP response will take a string. And that string probably will be like an HTML document. Let's try doing this. We'll just pass it an ordinary string. And we get this. And the browser here is doing some work for us. It's trying real hard to formulate this as a sensible thing. So we didn't pass in this tag, but the browser is doing it. We could, let's try explicitly making this HTML, an HTML element. Refresh that. And this time, this is actually a paragraph. So we can do that. So that's basically it. We'll kind of let's put HTTP responses on hold for a sec and take a look at the request object. So instead of printing hi, I'm going to print the request. So I print the request object, which is right here. So this is a WSGI request, and WSGI is just it's a standard API or standard basically set of requirements for making Python servers. So we don't need to worry about what this is really, but that's what that is. It's not very useful to us. So let's go back to the documentation. And instead of HTTP response, we can look at the request. All right, so the HTTP request, well, it tells us initially that Django creates the HTTP request object that contains metadata about the request. So Django basically will build the request for us. You can see that it has a bunch of attributes. So so here it looks like this is a WSGI request, not an HTTP request object. So let's check the type. We can refresh this. Go back here. And this is a WSGI request. And we could look at that and we would find almost certainly that that inherits from the HTTP request. Now if we want to look at the, let's see. This is a basic HTTP request. And let's do, I don't know if this, where this might be, but Django.core.handlers from core.wsgi import WSGI.
Your from statement is misspelled. WSGE.
Oh, thank you. So WSGI request inherits from HTTP request. So this gets into, like, we talked about this. I don't think we really talked about this, but type checking is kind of, it's not a Pythonic thing to do. Use something like is instance request. So checking type, it just gives us like the top level. It won't check the inheritance. We won't get all the information we need. But if you use is instance, then that's more of a side note. But just so you know that this inherits from this. So that's just, yeah. So if you're interested in looking around in the Django source code, which isn't necessarily the most helpful thing to do for figuring out how to use it, but I think it's good to do even if you don't really understand it. All right. So the request. So we know that the request is an HTTP request object. So that was the whole point of that. This documentation is telling us that we're going to get an HTTP request object, but it looked like a WSGI request. But that is in fact, it is a HTTP request. So there's a whole bunch of properties that we can access here. So body, path. So let's take a look at path. So print request.path. Sorry for all the window switching here. Let me just curl this request since we don't care what's showing. So here's the path that I went to, /myapp/practice, which is how Django knew to call this function in the first place. The first level URLs, the project level URLs, it grabbed my app and then handed the rest of this onto the app URLs, which had practice, and it found it here, and then it called this practice view, which I had defined here, and return this. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of, we can also use methods. We can find out if it was a GET request or a POST request. Let's see, there's a headers, there should be headers. We can check those out. So here are the headers from curl, which should be familiar: content length, content type, and so on. There's a few other things. The Django attributes set by middleware. You can look at the user, for example. The request object has a user. So let me first do meta. This is basically everything. So it's just going to be a big old mess. So here's all the stuff that I have. A lot of this is coming from my local environment. But let's do. This is basically the important stuff. So Django settings module. Yeah, so you can play around. Part of what the challenge for today is just looking around and figuring out everything that's there. The user is also something you can access. Is there a question?
Which one was the header again?
Which one was the header?
You said something, yeah, which one, which example was the header again?
You can, there's a header attribute that you
Oh.
could, or headers,
Okay.
HTTP request.headers. There's a whole bunch of, a whole bunch of attributes you can access. And when I do request.user, I get anonymous user. So again, not again, but this HTTP request object is handled by Django. Django constructs it. It constructs it in part based on the request, in part based on its own internal middleware. So if we look, you don't need to know this in any kind of detail, but so there are all these installed apps and this middleware. So the middleware is basically like a filter on the request object. So you can think of these are classes, but you can think of them as classes or functions. So the request object is just going to pass through all of these things and get modified at every step. And once it passes through all these filters, we're going to get the request object that we get, which is why the request object has things beyond simply the headers, which it gets from the client. It has things like user, which is not anything that, this is something that Django has. And this actually comes from built-in Django authentication system. So anonymous user is basically not someone who's logged in. So there's a default user. So you can read up on the Django user if you like. You don't really need to know about it right now, but you can. All right. Okay. So that's kind of the basics of setting up this whole flow. But in our view here, we're just returning. This is not really what we want to do. What we want to be doing is returning an HTML document. So Django has some convenience functions that combine other things. So remember, at the end of the day, what we have to return is an HTTP response object. But we want to return an HTTP response object with a template in it, so an HTML template. So let's look at the docs real quick. So we've been dealing with the view, so now we're going to look at the template. So this is a convenient way to generate HTML dynamically. So this is a template is basically like a skeleton HTML document that you can you can inject specific pieces of information into every time you render it. So we'll see how that looks. And it has its own kind of peculiar syntax that we'll see a little bit of in a sec. But in order to use that template, I'm just gonna import something. So from Django.shortcuts, import render. So render is a shortcut, so it combines a couple. You could get the same thing by kind of putting a couple other things together, but this is a nice shortcut. So we'll return. Return.
It looks like that the views.py file already has render imported
Oh, right.
automatically.
Thank you. Yes, it does. So we'll return render, and render takes two things. There are two required parameters and one optional parameter. So the first thing will be the request object. It seems a little weird, but you have to pass in the request object. So we'll just add that. And then the next thing you pass in is a template name, which is basically just going to be a string that's going to refer to the HTML template that you want to pass in. So I'm going to call, we haven't made it yet, but we'll call it main.html. So we'll give it the path here, which will be the app. So my app.main. We don't have that yet. So if we try to call this, we're going to get an error. Template does not exist error, which is a pretty self-explanatory error. So we're going to have to go create that template. So Django has a seemingly bizarre kind of default file structure that it wants for templates. So you go into the app. So we're in my app. I'm going to create a folder called templates. And then within the templates folder, I'm going to create another folder that has the name of the app. So my app. So this is just how Django does it. You could change these defaults, but that's how it is. Okay, so then within this inner my app folder, I'm going to create main.html. So let me just give it some defaults. So let's save this. Let's see here. Template does not exist. Let's see. I think, let me double check. Okay, sorry about that. So you don't use the dot syntax, you use the path. So my app/main.html. And here I get the actual HTML document. So this is a full-fledged HTML document. So again, all of the routing is happening the same way, but instead of just returning kind of this bare HTTP request object, this is still returning an HTTP request object. We can actually do this same test. So let's do this test. This is false, actually. It is a response. So it's still creating a response, but it might not look like it, but that's what's happening. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to where that was. All right. So we're going to return a response, and it's going to be this HTML document that we want. But oftentimes we don't just, so right now we have just like a static HTML. So this works. You can do this with Django, but you definitely don't need Django to serve up a static HTML page. So one thing we do is use templates. So if you look at again, this is not like difficult to figure out. It's just a matter of looking at the documentation and getting the particulars. But you can pass it kind of specific information. So I'm going to add a p tag. And this is going to be a variable. So I'm just going to call this name. So I'm going to go here. And refresh this. And here I have an empty p tag. This p tag is empty. It doesn't have, brackets and name in it. It's just totally empty. So there's a built-in renderer that Django uses that takes care of this. That's why this doesn't show up. This right here is not just regular HTML. So we can actually dynamically change this if we go into the views. And this third parameter here is actually going to be a context object. So we can pass that if there's, particular information, information that's particular to this request, we can modify our response. So context equals to name. So we're refreshing this. So Bob got injected into this HTML template. So the third parameter in this render function is context. So name Bob, name here. That's what this is picking up. So you can do a lot. You can definitely get a lot more complicated with this. So I'll just do. You can also do conditional logic here. You can read the documentation and see everything that's available. So the basic things that you need are, if you're just inserting a value, use the double brackets. If you're doing some kind of logic, it's a little vague, but things like statements, like if, you can do for loops, you can do all kinds of stuff. But so if name, actually I'm going to leave that there, and let's do another one. So if age, and then another weird thing is that you have to close if statements and for loops and other things. So, and if this is just syntax details you can look up, so don't worry about memorizing it. So what this is saying is, now we have this HTML document and we want to dynamically get name. And we also want to see if there's an age, we want to display it in this paragraph tag. And if there isn't, then we want to do nothing. So if we refresh this, you see we get the name Bob, and there's nothing. It's not like there's an empty p tag like we saw the first time. There's just nothing there. So this just didn't, the template render did not add this. So our HTML, it's not like this is hidden somewhere in the HTML document. It's just it didn't get created. So we can go back into views and we can change that. We can add age. If we refresh this, then now this shows up. So that, I mean, that is the basics for views and templates with Django. So just, are there questions? Okay, so to review, let's look at the basic flow here. So a client will make a request. It goes to urls.py. First, it will go to the project level urls.py, and that can be further farmed out to an app urls.py. And then whatever specific route that ends up being, there will be a corresponding function in views.py that's going to get called. That function will get called. It will do whatever logic it has to do, like making requests to databases and so on, which we're not worrying about today. And ultimately, it will render an HTML document. It could be JSON or other things, but for our purposes right now, it's going to be HTML. And then it's going to format that and send that as a response back to the client. So looking at the Django code, we have my project, which is obviously the project. We have this urls.py. Can delete that. urls.py. So there are two top level routes. This is a built-in admin, which we can worry about later. And we're saying if anyone goes to /myapp, then I want you to take that request and hand it off to the myapp.urls file. And the myapp.urls file is right here, which we had to create this file. And we're saying, okay, after that, so nothing, so base URL /myapp/practice. If anything hits practice, then this is going to get activated. And then this function that we have written from views is going to get called. So in views.py, the practice function, it's going to accept a request object. And then you can do whatever you want with the request object. You know, you can have query parameters. You can check if it's a GET request or a POST request. Then in here somewhere, you could make a call to the database based on what was in the request, return some information, process it, you know, handle form submission, do whatever you're going to do, and then format or create a context object, and then return an HTTP response object, which is going to, and you're going to pass it almost all the time, not just a string, but a rendered HTML template. And the render function, first thing it's going to take is a request. So you just have to keep passing the request along. Then the path to the HTML document. And the default convention for that is within the app, you create a folder called templates. Then within templates, you create another folder with the same name as the app. And then within that, you create your HTML document. So you'll pass it that that path, and then the context, whatever that happens to be. Probably this is going to be dynamically generated from database calls and so on. And then the actual HTML, you have the basic HTML document, and then this is the particular stuff that could be different from one request to the next. So you can do things like just insert a value, you can check if a value exists and conditionally insert it, you can have for loops, you can process, you can call functions, there's just all kinds of things you can do here. So there's a lot going on, but I promise you, you'll do it a few times and you'll start to see how it'll start flowing. It might be a little rocky in the beginning, but.
Hey Chad, do people ever put the views in the project folder?
Yeah.
The URLs, or is that just not good? Or
you could definitely do that. So I mean, you could just not really, you could just not have an app, and you could within this URLs just write this, and then you can even right here just write like def. What do we call this? Let's just do that. Practice. I'm gonna make this simpler. Well, this should work. I have to put this on top. Django.http. Response. And let's just call. I'm going to change this to so that works. So we didn't, we could delete this app. So we're not using the app. We're not using a views file. We're not doing anything. We're just cramming everything all into this single URLs file, which you can do, but really shouldn't. Is that?
yeah, I just wasn't sure for if like the root page or whatever on a thing that has a bunch of apps that you might, I guess you would create an app to handle the root page and then a bunch of other apps to branch off of it for best practice.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you want to structure it, but yeah, well, once you start having a more complicated app, yeah, you have to start making these decisions. But there probably won't be very much that you would specifically handle at this highest level.
Chad, I have two questions.
Okay.
The first one is in the views file, when you're passing the response or the request,
Yeah.
is that still coming in purely from the request? It hasn't been parsed at all from anywhere?
Yeah, so this is, again, the request is something that Django takes care of.
It's
And-
already been.
Yeah, so it's not something you can, I believe it's read only. Let's try. Yeah. So I get an error here telling me that WSGI request object does not support item assignment. So
It's kind of off limits as far as changing it around.
Yeah, you can't. I think there are things that you can change on it, but I have to double check that. But essentially, if you want to change anything on the request, you want to do it in the middleware, which is a topic that is really beyond what we're talking about right now. But
Sure.
if you wanted to change something on request objects, you would do it in middleware.
So it's not exactly the request coming from the client, but it's Django's packaged version of that request, and we don't mess around with it, really.
Yes. So the request that we're getting, that we have available to us in our views, has been processed by Django. So it's not
Okay.
simply just the client headers. It's not just that HTTP request. It's that processed by Django plus all of the other stuff that Django puts in there.
And then the second question I have
You could optionally, just by the way, you could optionally just delete all of this middleware and not use it, and not use any of the installed apps, but then you're basically not really using Django anymore. But so that you could potentially do that, and you would have a stripped down request object. Sorry, did you have another question?
Yeah, I was trying to fix my sound.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's better now, but
It was definitely interesting.
it's because I'm just melding with my computer.
Yeah.
So the other question I have was, would you ever use the same view and or the same template from one endpoint request? And in those cases, would you be able to use logic that refers to the request? I think you kind of answered that by answering the request part. Like you can't get in there and.
So if you wanted to have like the same request, or the two different requests render the same template.
Yeah, or very slightly different ones.
Yeah, you can definitely. So we'll see as we look more into templates. You can put templates inside of other templates. So you'll often have like a base template, and then you'll insert kind of chunks depending on what you're doing. So yes. All right, so I'll go over the challenge. If there are other questions, feel free to ask. But the challenge is fairly open. You're just going to go through this process, kind of what we did. You create a project, create an app, hook everything up, and then you're going to want to display information about the client's request. So in the views, you can grab stuff from the request, whatever strikes your fancy, and then put that in a context object, and then pass that here, and you'll create an HTML template, and you can insert stuff in there as appropriate. So don't worry about, you're not going to have to use a model or a database or anything like that. All right, any final questions?